beautiful thing is, just like a good father who would seek justice for those who are hurting his kids, Habakkuk now sees that God will come and make things right. And all of a sudden, it transforms his perspective. But how can Habakkuk be so sure? How all of a sudden is he confident that the biggest empire the world had ever seen would fall to the feet of Yahweh? Because if God did it before, he can do it again. He asks this question to himself as he's thinking about the sense of judgment. Has there ever been a time when a world power ever dominated, abused, and persecuted God's people? Has there ever been a time when this has happened before that I can use that as kind of credit to trust God for the future? And he goes, oh, the Exodus story. Y'all remember the Exodus? Egypt was a great world power. Pharaoh had temples built and a kingdom expanded at the expense of Hebrews who had been enslaved in bondage for centuries. Nervous about these immigrants that came into their country when Joseph brought his family in and now they began to expand and populate in numbers, he chooses violence. He chooses to enslave them. He chooses to persecute them. He even kills the male children of the Hebrews when they first are born. The situation was bleak, and even when Moses, who is burdened by the condition of his people, tries to help, Pharaoh actually says, y'all gonna have to work harder now. Y'all, apparently you got enough time to complain. More bricks, less straw. And how did God respond? Well, this is what is alluded to in such poetic ways that we're going to break down. So in verse 2, Habakkuk says, O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. And this fear is talking about a reverent sense of awe and amazement. Habakkuk reflects on God's resume, and he realizes that he is more than qualified to handle the problem of today based on his past history. You know that's how resumes work. People decide, okay, let me look at what you've done in the past to see if you can handle the job that I'm going to give to you in the present, or potentially that you're looking for, that you're applying to. Well, this is what Habakkuk does, and we start to see what he has in mind. In verse 5, we read, before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. Well, when did pestilence and plague follow God in the showdown with Pharaoh? Well, we know it is the 10 plagues. The plagues literally of blood, frogs, gnats, flies, dead livestock, and pestilence in the form of boils. More judgment in the form of hail, locusts, darkness, and even the death of the firstborn of the Egyptians. And so Habakkuk reflects back and remembers that these things followed at your heels. Now, the interesting thing is that this battle also shows something very important for us today. This battle between the kingdom of the world and the kingdom of the Lord, of spiritual wickedness in high places. Because something very interesting happens when God does the first 2 plagues. When he turns the Nile's water into blood, which was also a judgment on their God because they worshiped the Nile, it says in the Bible that Pharaoh's magicians did the same. Now, it doesn't specify, was this an illusion? Was this real spiritual power? It doesn't specify it because it ultimately doesn't matter. But it matters to us that then the second plague happens, the one of multiplying frogs, and it says once again, Pharaoh's magicians did the same. Be very careful when you can get enamored by different people, soothsayers, people who have words that seem to be so amazing and insightful that they can look and say, hey, I can do the same thing that God can do. Be very careful. Because the scriptures don't say in either way that this was completely a fraud and fake or that this was real. But ultimately what we do know is that in the scriptures, there is such a thing as evil demonic power. It does exist. The difference is it's not ultimate power. It's not the type of power that can compete with God. Because once it got to plague 3, the gnats, they were like, oh yeah, we can't do that. The other thing that they couldn't do was stop the thing. Like you would think the main important valuable thing wouldn't be like, hey, look, we can turn water into blood too. It would be like turn the blood back into water maybe so we could drink it. But they couldn't do that as well because there were limitations. And I think in our world, sometimes we get all caught up, or people do, with this idea of, well, wait, maybe there's spiritual power and authority in other places. It's like they might have power, but they don't have the authority of the Lord. Amen? So so he's reflecting on the pestilence and plague. This is an iconic, significant moment in the people of Israel's history. Habakkuk is not the only one who has reflected back on this time, even though it happened generations prior to him. In Psalm 78, verses 12 and 13, we see the same thing. It reads, "He did miracles in the sight of their ancestors in the land of Egypt, in the region of Zoan. He divided the sea and led them through. He made the water stand up like a wall." So Habakkuk is in awe of what God has done, just like the psalmist who wrote this song. And look at the poetic writing again, and this helps us to see where it's at. He divided the sea and he made the water stand up like a wall. This is what Habakkuk has in mind when he asked the rhetorical question, was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers and your indignation against the sea when you rode on your horses, on your chariots of salvation? Oh, I love this part. So he goes from thinking about when God split the Red Sea, and then we also know when, in order for them to go into the promised land, there was also a splitting of the Jordan River. So this is the rivers and the sea. But then what is it about this when you rode on your horses and your horses' chariots of salvation? Well, you know what happens when Pharaoh decides to change his mind. At first he lets them go after the 10th plague. And then he goes, you know what? That's a lot of free labor we giving up. No, let's go get that back. And he sends his army of chariots after the people. And so what Habakkuk is reflecting on, and he's talking his talk right there, is that they sent hundreds, thousands of chariots after us. God had one chariot, singular, that he used to crush them by closing the sea back up on them. Because that's the difference of dealing with our God versus dealing with the people who would try to hold us back. So this whole prayer is a reflection on God's miraculous acts in the entire Exodus account. And he doesn't go in order because he's just going through image after image. So some of the Exodus account even takes place when once they not only just leave from Egypt, right, and get the deliverance of the 10 plagues and the Red Sea splitting, and then that happens, but then there's all this miraculous stuff that happens when they go into the wilderness. That's the next step, right? And then all of a sudden God has to provide for them in a desert area that has no water, that has no food. And so you see these illusions taking place in Habakkuk. But then even after the wilderness, they go into the promised land, and now they have to then go and trust God to take lands. And this is where you see Jericho and the walls of Jericho falling. And all of these illusions that are happening. And why is this important? Because what Habakkuk is reflecting on is that God was faithful even as the situations changed of his people. Now, all this happened before Habakkuk was born. But remembering the past helped Habakkuk be faithful in the present. Habakkuk heard from others and believed what God had done before. This is why it's important for us to listen to the testimonies of those around us. You know, when our previous generations talk about how they made it over, how God got them through, and they tell these stories, and you're like, okay, I can't really relate to this, or it's getting a little bit long. Sit and listen to these things, because these are the stories that give us perspective that if God did it before, he can do it again. All right, we're getting there. So Habakkuk focuses on a past Exodus in light of a current and a present and a future exile that is coming. And said if God got him through that, he can do it again. Now, this is where verse 2 is helpful to look at multiple translations sometimes to get the full nuance of what it's saying. So I put up the Message translation so you can really get a sense of what is being talked about in verse 2 of chapter 3. And this is how the Message puts it. It says, God, I have heard what our ancestors say about you, and I'm stopped in my tracks, down on my knees. Do among us what you did among them. Work among us as you worked among them. And as you bring judgment, as you surely must, remember mercy. Remember mercy. If God did it before, he can do it again. Now, it's also important for us to note that the conditions and the situations surrounding the Exodus are not the same as the exile. In the Exodus, it was pretty clear. God had led them into Egypt through Joseph and his family. They had multiplied. The people in power got afraid of this big and growing immigrant population, and so then they enslaved them. And so it was a pretty straightforward situation. We see in Exodus 3, God has compassion. He hears their cries after a long period of time. And then he moves. Well, in the exile, the thing that is different is it is their own sinful behavior and their rebellion against God that causes, it is the condition for which God is judging them. It's on them, in other words, that God decides to use the circumstances around them. And why is that important? It's important for a couple reasons. One, sometimes believers and people of faith get in trouble when we try to authoritatively explain the reasons why somebody is experiencing suffering, why a nation is experiencing suffering. And what we see is even in the scriptural context, there's multiple scenarios that are at play where sometimes it's a Job-like situation where his faith is being tested ultimately for our benefit. Sometimes it's an accountability situation where God is judging. But regardless of the situation, the amazing thing is that prayer, God, when you bring justice, remember mercy, still stands. God is not bound in his response to human sin based on who was the source of it. But there does give us a sense of clarity to know we have to walk humbly when we lean into these things. We don't know all the time why the suffering is there. But we do know a God who's willing to respond to it. Amen? Amen. What we can say with certainty is whether allowed or caused, God uses all things for the good. That's the promise.